My dad spent my dead mother's insurance on a $50,000 boat and refused to pay for my college. I made him pay for my entire degree. I was supposed to start college in the fall, and my dad Keith had always said he'd pay for it. We weren't rich, but he made good money as a regional manager, and Mom had life insurance that he got when she passed away 5 years ago. He'd been telling relatives for years about how he was going to send me to university, making himself look like Father of the Year at every holiday dinner. Then 2 months before graduation, he announced college was a scam, and I should learn a trade instead. He said degrees were just expensive paper, and real money came from working with your hands. This coming from a guy who hadn't touched a tool in 20 years and paid people to change his oil. What really happened was he'd joined this investment group with his buddy Vince, and they convinced him to put all the money into buying rental properties. He'd already spent $40,000 on 2 condemned houses they were going to flip. Mom's insurance money that was meant for my education was gone. I asked if he'd help with even just books or meal plans. He laughed and said if I was smart enough for college, I was smart enough to figure it out myself. Then he bought a $50,000 boat the next week because Vince said they needed it for client meetings. Nobody ever saw a client on that boat. Just Dad and Vince drinking beer every weekend. I enrolled anyway and took out loans. Dad made fun of me at every family event, saying I was going into debt for nothing while he was building an empire. His empire was 2 houses that needed new everything, and a boat that cost more in dock fees than my tuition. My Uncle Roy owned a construction company and asked Dad when he was starting the renovations. Dad said as soon as he learned how to do it himself because contractors were a ripoff. Roy just laughed and walked away. Dad spent weekends watching YouTube videos about home repair while his properties rotted. 6 months into school, Dad's first house got condemned by the city for black mold. He had to pay $15,000 just to get it demolished safely. The second house had squatters who destroyed everything inside. Dad tried to evict them but didn't know the laws and ended up owing them money for illegal eviction. Vince disappeared when the bills started coming. Stopped answering calls and moved to another state. That's when Dad got desperate and started calling me asking about my student loans. He wanted to know how much I could borrow and if I could take extra for family expenses. I told him loans were a scam just like college and hung up. He showed up at my dorm demanding I help him since he raised me alone after Mom died. My roommate Alex was there and heard everything. Alex's dad was a professor in the business department and Alex told him the story. His dad said it was perfect for this entrepreneurship competition they were running. The winner got a full ride scholarship plus $20,000 in startup money. The catch was, you needed a business partner over 30 with management experience. I called Dad and said I had a way to save his investments, but he had to sign up as my business partner for this competition. Dad jumped at it thinking he'd get access to the prize money. We entered as a property management educational firm that taught real estate through hands-on experience. Dad had to attend every meeting and present with me. He also had to sign papers making him liable for any business conducted under our partnership. I made sure our presentation focused on all his failures as learning opportunities. The judges loved the honesty. We won. Here's what Dad didn't read in the contract. The scholarship went directly to the student partner only. The $20,000 startup money had to be used for business expenses approved by the school. And the business partnership agreement he signed included a clause that the senior partner would cover any educational expenses incurred by the junior partner as professional development. It was legally binding. I submitted my tuition bills as professional development expenses. Dad tried to fight it, but he'd signed everything without reading. The school's legal department backed me up because it was their standard contract. Dad had to pay my tuition or get sued for breach. He sold the boat to cover it. But I wasn't done. Every semester I added more expenses. Books were professional, materials. My meal plan was networking opportunities. My study abroad program was international business exposure. My new laptop was essential equipment. My parking pass was transportation to business meetings. Dad had to pay all of it or breach the contract, which would cost him even more. He tried dropping out of the partnership, but the contract ran for 4 years with massive early termination fees. He sold his truck and downsized his apartment. Started driving a 10-year-old sedan and shopping at discount stores. Meanwhile, I got my degree debt-free with honors. The business we created actually made money because I ran tutoring services through it. I kept meticulous records and followed every rule. Dad never saw a penny because the contract specified profits went to educational expenses first. After graduation, the partnership finally ended. Dad thought he was free until I started my master's program. I walked into the financial aid office with my acceptance letter and the first semester bill tucked inside a folder. The clerk behind the desk looked up from her computer and smiled when I handed everything over. She scanned the documents and her smile faded a little when she saw the partnership contract reference number. She asked if I was sure about submitting this under the business arrangement, and I told her yes. Everything was approved through the legal department last year. She printed a receipt and said the senior partner would receive notification within 24 hours. I thanked her and left feeling satisfied that the system was working exactly as designed. My phone rang 2 hours later while I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment. Dad's name lit up the screen and I let it ring 3 times before answering. His voice came through shaking and loud, asking what the hell I thought I was doing. I could hear him breathing hard between words. He said the contract ended when I graduated, that we had a deal, that this wasn't fair. I sat down on my couch and waited for him to finish yelling. When he finally stopped, I explained very calmly that the contract specified 4 years of partnership duration, starting from the date he signed it. He signed it during my sophomore year, which meant we still had 2 full years remaining. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he started shouting again, saying I was destroying him, that I was ruining his life on purpose, that he couldn't afford this. I reminded him that early termination was an option, but the fees would cost him more than just paying my tuition. He called me something ugly and hung up. I sat there holding my phone and felt nothing except a cold satisfaction. The next morning I got an email from Tamara Solomon confirming that my expense submission was valid under the existing partnership terms and that the senior partner had been notified of his payment obligation. The email included a payment schedule and late fee structure. Everything was documented and official. 3 days later, someone knocked on my apartment door at 7 in the morning. I looked through the peephole and saw Dad standing there in wrinkled clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. Dark circles made his eyes look hollow and his hair stuck up on one side. I opened the door and he just stared at me for a second before asking if he could come in. I stepped aside and he walked past me into the living room. He looked around at my new furniture and the nice TV I'd bought with tutoring money, and his face got tight. He turned to me and his voice came out quiet and broken. He said he could barely afford rent and groceries, that his savings were gone, that he was working extra hours just to make the modified payments from my undergraduate years. I crossed my arms and told him I understood his situation was difficult. He asked me to please release him from the contract, said he'd do anything, that he was begging me. I reminded him that early termination fees would bankrupt him faster than just continuing the payments. He sat down on my couch without asking, and put his head in his hands. I watched him sit there and part of me wanted to feel bad, but mostly I just remembered him laughing when I asked for help with books. After a few minutes, he stood up and left without saying anything else. My phone rang that afternoon and Alexander's name showed up. I answered and he started by congratulating me on getting into the master's program. His voice sounded weird though, careful and uncomfortable. I thanked him and mentioned I'd already submitted my first semester expenses through the partnership. The silence stretched out before he said his dad wanted to talk to me about the arrangement. I asked what Professor Parks wanted, and Alexander admitted his dad was concerned the situation had become something other than educational. I felt irritation spike through me, and asked what that meant. Alexander said his dad thought maybe I was exploiting the contract now instead of using it for its intended purpose. I told Alexander that his dad created this whole system and wrote the contract terms, so maybe he should have thought about that before handing me the tools. Alexander got quiet and said he just wanted to make sure I was okay with how everything was going. I told him I was fine and ended the call. The first week of graduate classes kept me busy with orientations and syllabus reviews. The coursework looked intense but manageable. I submitted my expense report on Friday, including $600 for textbooks, $2,000 for an upgraded laptop needed for data analysis, and $800 for professional clothes since networking events were mandatory. The total came to $3,400 on top of tuition. I got the payment confirmation email the following Wednesday, 2 days past the deadline. A note from Dad's bank was attached saying the transaction had been delayed due to insufficient funds in the primary account. The payment eventually cleared, but I found out later from Madison that Dad had to take out a personal loan at 18% interest to cover it. Madison called me that same week sounding worried. She said Dad had shown up at Uncle Roy's office asking to borrow money again. Uncle Roy turned him down and told him he made his own bed by being greedy with Mom's insurance money. Madison asked if I was really okay with how far this had gone. I told her Dad made choices, and now he was dealing with the results, same as anyone else would. She didn't sound convinced, but she dropped it. My first meeting with my new advisor happened the next Monday in her office on the 3rd floor of the business building. Lorelei Calderon was maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a direct way of talking that I appreciated. She reviewed my academic plan and asked about the funding arrangement. I explained the partnership structure and how the tutoring business generated revenue. She looked impressed and said the business model was solid. Then she pulled up some communication from the financial aid office and her expression changed. She said Dad's payments were coming in late with notes about financial hardship. She asked if I was aware of the difficulty my father was having meeting his obligations. I told her I was aware and that he'd signed a contract knowing the terms. She looked at me for a long moment before saying that being legally right and being ethically right weren't always the same thing. I left her office feeling defensive and annoyed. 2 weeks into the semester, Dad hired a lawyer. I got a call from August Crawford, who introduced himself as an attorney specializing in contract disputes. He said he'd been retained to review the partnership agreement and explore options for early termination or modified terms. His voice was professional and careful. He asked if I'd be willing to discuss the matter. I told him everything was handled through the university legal department and he should contact them. He said he already had, and that Tamara Solomon confirmed the contract was valid and enforceable. He'd spent 3 days reviewing every clause looking for loopholes or grounds to challenge the agreement. He found nothing. He told me very directly that Dad signed the contract voluntarily, that the terms were clear, and that pursuing litigation would cost Dad money he didn't have for a case he couldn't win. He said the best option was for Dad to negotiate with me directly for modified terms. I thanked him for the information and said I wasn't interested in modifications. August called again 2 days later with a formal proposal. Dad would continue paying tuition and standard fees, but we'd eliminate the additional expenses like books, equipment, and living costs that I'd been claiming as professional development. The monthly payment would drop by about 40%. August explained this would give Dad breathing room while still ensuring my education got funded. I listened to the whole pitch and then told him no. The contract allowed all professional development costs, and I intended to use that provision fully. August asked if I understood I was causing my father significant financial hardship. I said my father showed me no mercy when I needed help, so I wasn't interested in showing him any now. August sighed and said he'd relay my response to his client. The tutoring business landed a major contract that same week with the University Academic Support Center. They wanted us to provide group study sessions for students struggling in freshman business classes. The contract was worth $15,000 for the semester. I signed the agreement and hired 2 other graduate students to help run the sessions. The business was actually profitable now, generating enough money that I could theoretically cover some of my own expenses. But the partnership contract specified that all business profits went toward educational costs first, which meant Dad still had to pay his full share before any profit distribution could happen. I submitted the contract to Tamara Solomon as documentation that the business was thriving exactly as intended. She sent back a one-line email saying she'd noted it in the file. I sat in my apartment that night looking at my bank statements and the tutoring business accounts. Everything was working. The system was functioning exactly as designed. Dad was paying for the education he'd promised and then stolen from me. Justice was served through legal means that he'd agreed to. So why did I feel so hollow sitting there alone in my expensive apartment while Dad slept on an air mattress across town? I tried calling Dad 3 times over the next week, and each call went straight to voicemail. I sent him emails about the next payment deadline and got nothing back. The silence stretched into 2 weeks, then 3, and I started checking my bank account every morning to see if the tuition money had arrived. It hadn't. The payment deadline passed and still nothing. I called Tamara at the school's legal department and told her Dad had missed the payment. She pulled up our contract file and said she'd send him a formal breach notice. 2 days later, she forwarded me a copy of the letter she'd sent to his apartment. It explained in very clear language that he had 10 days to make the payment or face legal action. The penalty fees for breach would add another $15,000 to what he already owed. I read the letter twice and felt a weird mix of satisfaction and dread. The mail came on a Thursday afternoon, and there was a cream-colored envelope with handwriting I didn't recognize. No return address. I opened it standing in my apartment hallway and found a single-page letter from Adelaide Woods. She was a family friend who'd been close with Mom before she died. The letter asked if I'd meet her for coffee at the place near campus. She said she understood I was angry with Dad, but she wanted to talk to me about something important. I almost threw the letter away, but something about the way she wrote it made me curious. I texted her that I'd meet her Saturday morning. The coffee shop was busy when I got there, but Adelaide had already claimed a corner table. She looked older than I remembered, with gray streaks in her dark hair and lines around her eyes. She hugged me and said I looked so much like my mom it hurt her heart. We ordered coffee and sat down, and Adelaide didn't waste time with small talk. She said she'd heard about what was happening with Dad and the contract. She told me she understood my anger because Dad had done something terrible by spending Mom's insurance money and breaking his promise. But then she asked me a question that made my stomach drop. She wanted to know if Mom would want me using her insurance money as a weapon this way. I tried to argue that I wasn't using it as a weapon. I was just making Dad keep his promise. But Adelaide shook her head. She said Mom had wanted that money to help me get an education, but she'd also wanted it to help our family stay together after she was gone. Adelaide asked if destroying Dad financially was really what Mom would have hoped for. I left the coffee shop feeling angry and defensive, but also sick because Adelaide's question kept echoing in my head. I'd been so focused on making Dad pay that I hadn't let myself think about what Mom would actually want. The 9th day after the breach notice arrived, I was sitting in my economics class when my phone buzzed with a bank notification. The tuition payment had gone through. I checked the transaction details and saw it was a money order instead of Dad's usual check. After class, I called Madison and asked if she knew anything about Dad's situation. She was quiet for a minute and then told me Dad had sold most of his furniture. She'd driven past his apartment building the week before and seen him loading a couch and kitchen table into someone's truck. Madison said her dad had heard from a mutual friend that Dad was sleeping on an air mattress now. I sat in my car in the parking lot after that call and felt something twist in my chest. Part of me felt satisfied that Dad was finally experiencing real consequences for his choices. He'd spent Mom's money on stupid investments and a boat while telling me to figure out college myself. Now he was sleeping on an air mattress and selling his furniture to pay for my education like he should have done from the start. But another part of me felt sick knowing I was actively making my father's life miserable. I was choosing the most expensive options for everything because the contract let me. I was watching him suffer and calling it justice. Thanksgiving came and Uncle Roy invited me to dinner at his house like he did every year. I showed up with a store-bought pie and found the house full of relatives, but the atmosphere felt wrong. Everyone was being too polite and careful with their words. Nobody mentioned Dad or the contract situation, but it hung over everything like smoke. We sat down to eat and I realized Dad's usual spot at the table was empty. I asked Uncle Roy where Dad was and the whole table went quiet. Roy cleared his throat and said Dad probably felt too ashamed to show up. He said Dad knew everyone had heard about what he'd done with the insurance money and what was happening now as a result. Roy didn't say it in a mean way, but it still felt like an accusation. I made it through dinner and left early, claiming I had studying to do. I spent the next week working on my spring semester course selection and financial planning. The master's program offered a study abroad component for international business research that would take place over spring break. The program cost an additional $12,000, including travel, accommodation, and course fees. It was legitimate and valuable for my degree. Students who completed the international research component had better job placement rates and higher starting salaries. I filled out the application and submitted it along with my other spring semester expenses to the financial aid office. The total came to $18,000 for the semester. I knew it was a lot. I knew Dad would have to work overtime and maybe take out another loan to cover it. I also knew the contract allowed all professional development costs, and this definitely qualified. I told myself I was making smart educational choices that would pay off in my career. But I also knew I was choosing the most expensive options possible, because I wanted Dad to feel the financial pain he'd caused me when he spent Mom's insurance money. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to scramble for money and stress about payments and give up things he needed. August Crawford sent me an email in early December requesting a formal mediation session. He said he was representing Dad and attempting to modify the contract terms, and he thought a neutral third party might help us reach an agreement. I agreed to attend, but I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I printed out every email where Dad had bragged about paying for my education. I pulled up old Facebook posts where he'd told relatives he was so proud to send his daughter to university. I made a timeline of every dollar of Mom's insurance money he'd wasted on the condemned houses, and the boat, and all the dock fees and maintenance. I documented every time he'd lied to family members about being a generous father, while actually planning to abandon me. The mediation took place in a conference room at a legal office downtown. August was there with Dad, who looked thin and tired in a wrinkled shirt. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who explained the ground rules and asked us each to present our perspective. Dad went first and admitted he'd made terrible financial decisions. He said joining the investment group with Vince was stupid, and buying the rental properties without knowing what he was doing was stupid, and spending $50,000 on a boat was stupid. He said he was wrong to back out of his promise to pay for my education, and he understood why I was angry. But then he said I'd become cruel and vindictive. He said I was punishing him beyond what was fair, that I was choosing expensive options specifically to hurt him, that I was watching him suffer and enjoying it. He said Mom would be heartbroken to see what I'd turned into. I got so angry hearing him say that I stood up and walked out before anyone could stop me. I drove back to my apartment and threw myself into my coursework and the tutoring business. My grades were perfect, and the business was thriving with more students signing up every week. I should have felt successful, but instead I was having trouble sleeping. I kept having dreams where Mom was sitting across from me looking disappointed. In the dreams, she never said anything, but her expression told me everything. Alexander called in mid-December and said his dad wanted to talk to me about something. I met Professor Parks in his office, and he explained that he wanted to feature our business partnership in a case study about entrepreneurship education. He thought it was a perfect example of how competition programs could create real-world learning opportunities. But he was hesitating because of the family conflict dynamics. He asked if I was comfortable with the partnership being studied given everything that was happening between Dad and me. I told him the partnership was succeeding exactly as designed. It was teaching real lessons about contracts and accountability and consequences. The fact that those lessons were uncomfortable didn't make them less valuable. Professor Parks looked at me for a long moment and then said he'd think about it. Christmas was coming and my phone started ringing with calls from family members. Madison wanted to know if I was coming to Uncle Roy's holiday gathering. Roy's wife called to ask the same thing. My aunt from Dad's side called and asked very carefully if I expected Dad to be there. I told everyone I'd attend, and Dad could make his own choices about whether to show up. Madison called back 2 days before Christmas and said she'd talk to Dad. He told her he wasn't coming if I was going to be there. He said he couldn't stand watching me celebrate my success that was built on his financial destruction. Madison asked if I'd consider skipping this year, so Dad could see the family. I told her no and hung up. I drove to Uncle Roy's house on Christmas morning with a bottle of wine and the same fake smile I'd been wearing at family events for months. The driveway was packed with cars, and I could hear voices and laughter coming from inside before I even knocked. Roy opened the door and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. He didn't say anything about Dad not being there, but I could feel the question hanging in the air between us. The house smelled like turkey and cinnamon and all. The cousins were already gathered in the living room watching football. Madison waved at me from the kitchen where she was helping her mom with the side dishes. Everyone greeted me warmly and asked about school and the tutoring business and my plans for next semester. Nobody mentioned Dad or the contract or the fact that our family was splitting down the middle because of money that used to belong to my dead mother. We ate dinner at the big table with all the leaves extended, and I sat between Madison and her younger brother. The food was good, and the conversation stayed light, and I almost felt normal for the first time in weeks. After dessert, Adelaide Woods found me in the hallway looking at old family photos on the wall. She touched my arm gently and asked if we could talk privately. We went into Roy's home office and she closed the door behind us. Adelaide had been Mom's best friend since college, and she'd been trying to stay neutral in everything happening between Dad and me. She sat down in Roy's desk chair and folded her hands in her lap. She told me she'd been going through some boxes of Mom's things that she'd stored in her attic after the funeral. She said she found letters and a journal that Mom had kept during her illness. Adelaide's voice got softer when she said there were things in that journal I should probably see. Things about the insurance money and what Mom had hoped it would be used for. I felt my whole body tense up, and I told Adelaide I didn't need to read anything. I said I already knew Mom wanted the money to pay for my education, and Dad had stolen that from both of us. Adelaide shook her head slowly and said it wasn't that simple. She said Mom had written about both of us and her hopes for our family after she was gone. I stood up and told Adelaide I appreciated her concern, but I didn't need anyone's permission to hold Dad accountable for his choices. She looked sad but didn't argue. She just said the journal would be waiting whenever I was ready to see it. I left Roy's house earlier than planned and spent the rest of Christmas alone in my apartment. In January, I got a call from Madison asking if I'd heard about Dad's new apartment. I said I hadn't talked to him in weeks and didn't particularly care where he was living. Madison got quiet for a second, and then told me Dad had to move again because he couldn't afford the rent at his last place. She said he was now in a rough neighborhood on the east side where the buildings had bars on the windows and the parking lot was full of broken glass. I hung up feeling annoyed that everyone kept trying to make me feel guilty about Dad's situation. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. It was Corey Mullins, the guy who'd replaced Vince as Dad's drinking buddy and business advisor. Corey's voice sounded strained when he said he was calling because he was worried about Dad. He said Dad wasn't returning calls or showing up to their usual weekend plans. Corey had driven by Dad's new apartment and seen him through the window just sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. He asked if there was any way to resolve the situation between Dad and me before something bad happened. I told Corey that Dad made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences just like I'd had to live with his decision to steal my education fund. Corey said he understood why I was angry, but Dad seemed really broken, and maybe there was a middle ground we could find. I said the contract had terms, and Dad signed it, and that was the end of the discussion. Corey sighed and said he hoped I knew what I was doing. After he hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my laptop and trying not to think about Dad sitting alone in a dark apartment in a bad neighborhood. I opened my email and started filling out the expense submission form for the new semester. Conference attendance fees for 3 academic conferences came to $2,000. Professional association memberships for business and education organizations added another $800. Research materials, including database subscriptions and specialized software, totaled $1,500. Books and academic journals for my thesis research were another $1,200. The total came to $8,000 on top of the regular tuition and fees. I knew exactly what this would do to Dad. I knew he'd have to work overtime and take on extra projects at his job. I knew he'd be eating ramen and shopping at thrift stores and maybe skipping meals to make the payments. I clicked submit anyway and told myself he chose this when he bought that boat. He chose this when he laughed at me for asking about help with books. He chose this when he spent $40,000 on condemned houses while telling me college was a scam. The confirmation email arrived in my inbox within minutes, and I closed my laptop, feeling hollowed out inside. 3 days later, I got an email from Lorelei Calderon asking me to come to her office to discuss my academic progress. I showed up at the scheduled time, and she greeted me with her usual warm smile. She gestured for me to sit down and started by saying my grades were excellent, and my thesis proposal had been very well received by the committee. Then her expression shifted, and she said she wanted to talk about the partnership arrangement that was funding my education. She'd been contacted by the financial aid office about my father's payments. They'd expressed concern that the payments were causing him severe financial hardship based on multiple late payments and his communications with their office. Lorelei leaned forward and asked if I was considering the ethical implications of the situation beyond just the legal rights I had under the contract. I felt my face get hot, and I started to defend myself. I told her Dad had no problem spending $40,000 on failed investments and $50,000 on a boat while telling me to figure out college myself. I said he made fun of me at family events and called me stupid for taking out loans. I said he promised to pay for my education for years and then backed out 2 months before I started school. Lorelei listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me a question in this gentle voice that somehow made it worse. She said if my goal was to teach Dad a lesson, then at what point does the lesson end and I become the person causing harm? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She told me to think about it and said her door was always open if I wanted to talk more. I left her office, and that question followed me everywhere for days. I heard it when I was studying. I heard it when I was running the tutoring sessions. I heard it when I was trying to fall asleep at night. 2 weeks later, I was in the library working on a research paper when my phone buzzed with a call from Uncle Roy. His voice sounded urgent when he said I needed to get to the hospital. Dad had missed a payment deadline, and when Tamara Solomon from the school's legal department contacted him, he'd collapsed at work with chest pains. Roy said the ambulance had taken him to County General, and they'd run tests because they thought it might be a heart attack. I grabbed my keys and drove to the hospital with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Roy met me in the emergency room waiting area and told me the doctors had determined it was severe. Anxiety, not a heart attack, but they were keeping Dad overnight for observation. He said Dad's blood pressure was dangerously high, and the doctors were concerned about his mental state and the level of stress he was under. Roy looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read and said I should probably go see him. I walked down the hallway to Dad's room, feeling genuinely scared that I might have pushed too far. I knocked softly and pushed open the door. Dad was lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and an IV. He looked small and tired and older than I'd ever seen him. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he didn't yell or get angry. He just looked at me with these exhausted eyes and said he was sorry for everything. He said he didn't know how to fix what he broke between us. His voice cracked when he said it, and somehow that was worse than if he'd been furious. I stood there frozen, not knowing what to say or do. The monitors beeped steadily in the silence, and I could hear other patients and nurses in the hallway outside. I finally managed to say I was glad he was okay, and then I left before he could say anything else. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes, just trying to breathe. The hospital visit shook something loose inside me that I'd been trying to keep buried. I drove home and stared at my phone for an hour before finally texting Adelaide Woods. I told her I was ready to see whatever Mom had written if she still had it. Adelaide responded immediately, saying she could meet me the next day. We met at a coffee shop near campus, and Adelaide brought a cardboard box that looked old and worn. She set it on the table between us and told me to take my time with everything inside. There were letters Mom had written to various friends and family members. There were medical records and insurance documents. And at the bottom was a journal with a faded fabric cover that I recognized from Mom's nightstand. Adelaide squeezed my hand and said she'd wait at another table while I read. I opened the journal with trembling fingers and started reading Mom's handwriting from 5 years ago. The first entries were about her diagnosis and treatment plans. Then she started writing about practical matters like the life insurance policy and what she wanted the money to be used for. My vision blurred with tears as I read her words about hoping the insurance money would help me through college. She wrote that education was important, and she wanted me to have opportunities she never had. But then she kept writing. She wrote about Dad and how lost he would be without her. She worried about him being alone and struggling to rebuild his life after losing his partner of 20 years. She specifically wrote that she wanted the insurance money to help me through college, but also to help Dad create a new life and find happiness again. She said she hoped the money would bring us closer rather than drive us apart. She wanted us to support each other through the grief and become a stronger family unit. She wrote that she was trusting both of us to honor her wishes and take care of each other. The words destroyed me because they were the exact opposite of what had happened. I kept reading through tears that dripped onto the pages. Mom wrote about her fears that Dad would make impulsive decisions without her there to balance him. She wrote about hoping I would be patient with him and help guide him through the hard times ahead. She wanted the money to heal our family, and instead, it had become a weapon we were using to destroy each other. I closed the journal and sat there crying in the middle of the coffee shop while other customers pretended not to notice. Adelaide came back to the table and wrapped her arms around me while I sobbed into her shoulder. When I could finally breathe again, I told her I'd been so focused on punishing Dad that I'd completely lost sight of what Mom actually wanted. Adelaide said gently that Mom had loved both of us and wanted both of us to be okay. I realized then that Dad had stolen from both of us by wasting the money on his ego and bad investments. But I'd been dishonoring Mom's memory just as badly by using her insurance money as an instrument of destruction. She'd wanted it to heal our family and bring us together. Instead, I'd turned it into the thing that was tearing us apart. I'd been so angry about Dad's betrayal that I'd become someone Mom wouldn't recognize. Someone who was causing deliberate harm and calling it justice. I sat in that coffee shop holding Mom's journal and understanding for the first time that being legally right didn't make me morally right. The contract gave me power over Dad, but Mom never intended for that money to give either of us power over the other. She'd wanted it to help us both build better lives and support each other through loss. I'd taken her gift and twisted it into something ugly and cruel. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I knew something had to change. I left the coffee shop and went straight back to my apartment where I pulled up August's contact information from the contract paperwork. My hands shook while I dialed his number because calling him felt like admitting I'd been wrong, which was hard after spending so long being right about everything. He answered on the third ring with his professional lawyer voice asking how he could help me. I told him I wanted to talk about changing the contract terms to make things easier on Dad while still making sure my school got paid for. There was a long pause on the other end like he was waiting for the punchline or the catch. Then he said he was surprised, but he'd be happy to discuss options and could I come to his office tomorrow afternoon. I said yes and hung up before I could change my mind. The next morning I could barely focus on my graduate work because I kept thinking about what Mom wrote in her journal and how disappointed she'd be in both of us. August's office was downtown in one of those old buildings with creaky floors and dark wood everywhere. He had papers spread across his desk when I arrived, and he gestured for me to sit in the leather chair across from him. He explained we had several options for restructuring the partnership agreement. We could change the payment schedule to give Dad more time between payments. We could cap certain expense categories, so Dad would know exactly what he was responsible for, instead of getting surprised every semester. We could set a maximum annual amount that would give him predictability and breathing room to actually plan his budget. I listened to all of it and asked which option would help Dad the most, without letting him off the hook completely. August said honestly, the best approach would be combining several modifications, setting a reasonable annual cap while extending the timeline slightly, and eliminating the more luxury items I'd been claiming as business expenses. He pulled out a calculator and showed me numbers that would still cover my full tuition and basic education costs, but wouldn't leave Dad drowning every month. I agreed to all of it and signed papers authorizing him to prepare the modification documents. 2 days later, Uncle Roy called to tell me Dad was released from the hospital. The doctors gave him instructions about reducing stress and managing his anxiety better, which basically meant his whole life needed to change. I asked Uncle Roy if Dad seemed okay, and he said Dad looked tired but relieved to be going home. I sent a message to August asking him to forward something to Dad for me since I didn't want to call directly yet. The message said I wanted to talk about modifying our contract terms and asked if we could meet in person. August texted me back within an hour, saying Dad had responded immediately and wanted to meet as soon as possible because he had things he needed to say to me directly. We set up a meeting for the next day at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments, neutral ground where neither of us would feel like we had home advantage. I barely slept that night, running through different versions of the conversation in my head. The coffee shop was one of those generic chain places with uncomfortable chairs and burnt coffee, but it was public enough that we'd both have to stay calm. I got there first and ordered a drink I didn't want just to have something to do with my hands. Dad walked in 10 minutes later looking smaller somehow, like the hospital stay had shrunk him. We sat down across from each other and the silence was awful until Dad cleared his throat and started talking. He apologized. Actually apologized. For the first time since this whole thing started. He said he'd been selfish with Mom's insurance money, that he broke his promise about paying for my college because he was chasing stupid get-rich-quick schemes with Vince. He admitted he'd been a terrible father who prioritized his ego over my future and made everything about looking successful instead of actually being a good parent. His voice cracked when he talked about Mom and how ashamed he was that he'd wasted the money she left to take care of both of us. I sat there listening and feeling my own anger start to crack because hearing him actually admit everything out loud was different from just knowing it. He said he understood why I did what I did with the contract, that he deserved the consequences, but he was scared he'd end up losing me completely over money and pride. He asked if there was any way we could find a path forward that didn't end with us hating each other forever. I took a breath and told him I'd been cruel and vindictive. I said I used the contract to punish him beyond what was fair, that I'd been so focused on making him pay that I turned into someone mean and calculating. I admitted I knew he was struggling, and I kept adding expenses anyway because I wanted him to suffer like I suffered when he abandoned his promise. I told him Mom would be disappointed in both of us for letting money destroy our relationship and turn us into people she wouldn't recognize. My voice shook when I said that I'd read her journal and knew she wanted her insurance money to bring us together, not tear us apart. We both started crying right there in the coffee shop with other customers pretending not to notice. It was uncomfortable and messy with tears and napkins and neither of us knowing what to say next. But it also felt like the first honest moment we'd had in years, maybe since Mom died, where we were actually talking to each other instead of performing or attacking or defending. Dad reached across the table and I let him take my hand even though part of me still wanted to pull away. He said he wanted to do better and be better, that he'd get help and actually work on his problems instead of just making excuses. I said I wanted to stop being the person who used legal contracts as weapons against her own father. We sat there for another hour talking about Mom and what she would have wanted, and how we could honor her memory by actually trying to fix things between us. August had the contract modification papers ready within a week. Dad and I met at his office to go through everything together instead of separately like before. The new terms capped my annual expenses at $30,000 total, which would cover full tuition, reasonable fees, basic books and supplies, but eliminated the luxury study abroad programs and expensive equipment I'd been claiming. We extended the payment schedule slightly to give Dad smaller monthly amounts he could actually manage. August explained that Dad would still be paying a significant amount, but it wasn't designed to destroy him anymore, which was exactly what I wanted. Dad signed the papers, and so did I, and August witnessed everything to make it official. Walking out of that office building felt different from the first time, less like I'd won something and more like we'd both agreed to stop fighting. Dad thanked me for being willing to change the terms, and I told him I was sorry it took him ending up in the hospital for me to realize I'd gone too far. We stood on the sidewalk outside August's building in awkward silence until Dad said he had his first therapy appointment scheduled for next week. I told him I was glad and that I hoped it would help. He asked if maybe we could get coffee again sometime. Not to talk about contracts or money, just to talk. I said yes and meant it. Dad started going to therapy every week and actually doing the work instead of just showing up. His therapist helped him understand how his need to look successful to other people led to terrible decisions like wasting Mom's insurance money on investments he didn't understand and a boat he didn't need. He started talking about his impulsiveness and how he'd always tried to solve problems by throwing money at them or pretending they didn't exist. Madison told me later that Uncle Roy noticed Dad seemed different at family events, less defensive and more willing to admit when he didn't know something. Dad moved to a slightly better apartment in a safer neighborhood using money he'd saved from the modified payment schedule. It wasn't fancy, but he said he was learning to live within his means instead of constantly trying to impress people. He sold most of his remaining stuff from the old lifestyle, and bought practical furniture he could actually afford. His place looked normal instead of trying to look expensive, which he said felt better anyway. I kept going to my master's program with the modified funding arrangement in place. The anger was still there when I thought about what Dad did originally, how he threw away Mom's gift and broke his promise, but I wasn't actively trying to ruin his life anymore. The tutoring business kept generating good revenue, and I started setting aside some of the profits in a separate account. I planned to give it to Dad once the partnership officially ended, as a way of honoring Mom's wish for the money to help both of us. It felt right to do something that would have made her happy instead of just focusing on what would hurt Dad the most. My grades stayed strong and my research was going well. Lorelai checked in regularly to make sure the new arrangement was working, and seemed relieved that we'd found a solution that didn't involve destroying anyone. Spring came, and Uncle Roy called to invite both Dad and me to a family barbecue at his house. I hesitated because family gatherings had been awful for years with everyone taking sides or avoiding the subject entirely. But Uncle Roy said it was time we all tried to be normal again, and he wasn't taking no for an answer from either of us. The barbecue was on a Saturday afternoon, and I showed up early to help set up. Dad arrived exactly on time, looking nervous and carrying a store-bought pie. It was awkward at first with relatives who hadn't seen us together in months watching to see if we'd fight or ignore each other. But Uncle Roy kept things moving, putting us both on setup duty and making jokes that forced everyone to relax. Madison pulled me aside while Dad was helping Uncle Roy with the grill and told me she was proud of me for choosing to modify the contract. She said it took more strength to show mercy than it did to enforce the original harsh terms, that anyone could be cruel when they had power. But it took real character to give some of that power back. I told her I didn't feel strong. I felt guilty and confused and still angry sometimes. She hugged me and said that was normal, that forgiveness was messy and took time. Watching Dad interact with family members throughout the afternoon showed me how much he'd changed. He didn't brag or make excuses or try to look successful. He admitted when people asked that he'd made terrible financial decisions and was working on doing better. People seemed to respect the honesty more than they ever respected his bragging. 3 months after we modified the contract, Dad got a small promotion at work. His boss told him he'd noticed Dad was more focused and reliable lately, showing up on time and actually completing projects instead of getting distracted by schemes. The promotion came with a modest raise that helped Dad manage the modified payment schedule more comfortably. He called to tell me about it and sounded genuinely happy instead of trying to prove something. He said he was able to move to an even safer apartment, nothing fancy but a place where he felt secure and could afford the rent without panic. He told me he was learning to be okay with having enough instead of always wanting more, which his therapist said was major progress. I congratulated him and meant it because seeing him stable felt good after years of watching him spiral. My research advisor nominated me to present at a major conference in my field. The selection committee chose my paper about family business partnerships and ethical decision-making. I was excited but also nervous because it was my first major conference presentation. I mentioned it to Dad during one of our regular coffee meetups, and he immediately offered to attend to support me, even though it meant taking time off work and driving 3 hours to the conference city. I told him he didn't have to do that, but he insisted, saying he wanted to be there for something important to me. The conference was in a big hotel with hundreds of academics and researchers. Dad showed up wearing a suit he'd borrowed from Uncle Roy and sat in the audience during my presentation. Having him there felt significant, like we were building something new instead of just destroying what we had before. I presented my research on conflict resolution and family partnerships and talked honestly about how legal rights don't always align with moral rightness. Dad stayed for the whole thing and came up afterward to tell me he was proud. Other researchers asked questions about my case study, and Dad stood there listening while I explained our situation in academic terms. Walking out of that conference room with Dad beside me felt like proof that we were actually fixing things, slowly and imperfectly, but fixing them. 2 weeks after the conference, I got an email from the university's entrepreneurship department saying the tutoring business had been nominated for their annual Student Venture Award. The email listed 5 finalists, and we were competing against a food delivery startup, a sustainable fashion company, an app development team, and a tech consulting service. The award ceremony was scheduled for the following month with a panel of local business leaders serving as judges. I forwarded the email to Dad without much commentary, just a simple note saying we'd been nominated. He called me that evening sounding genuinely excited, asking if he needed to do anything or attend any meetings. I told him the ceremony was open to guests, but otherwise it was just a recognition thing, not a big deal. He said he wanted to be there if that was okay with me. Something about his tone made me say yes, even though part of me still felt weird about celebrating our business partnership given how it started. The award ceremony took place in the university's main auditorium with maybe 200 people attending, including students, faculty, local, entrepreneurs, and family members. Dad showed up wearing the same borrowed suit from the conference, sitting in the 3rd row next to Alexander and his parents. When they announced the finalists, each team had to give a 3-minute presentation about their business model, impact, and future plans. I went last and kept my remarks focused on the tutoring services we provided, the students we'd helped, and the revenue model that sustained operations. But at the end, I added something I hadn't planned, talking about how the business emerged from a complicated family situation that taught me unexpected lessons about accountability, the cost of broken promises, and the difference between justice and revenge. I said that sometimes the most valuable education comes from the hardest experiences, and that forgiveness isn't about excusing harm, but about choosing not to let anger define your future. The audience was quiet when I finished, and I saw Professor Parks in the front row looking relieved, like maybe the case study he'd been worried about might have a redemptive ending after all. They announced winners for different categories, and when they called the tutoring business for the overall Student Entrepreneurship Award, Dad stood up and cheered before I even made it to the stage. Getting that recognition felt significant not because of the award itself, but because it meant something good had come from all the pain and conflict. After the ceremony, Dad came up and hugged me, telling me he was proud, and that Mom would have been proud too. Alexander's parents congratulated us both, and Professor Parks shook Dad's hand saying the partnership had been educational in ways nobody anticipated. Walking out of that auditorium with the award plaque and Dad beside me felt like proof that we were building something new, instead of just destroying what we'd had before. Dad called me 3 days later asking if I wanted to get dinner, not for any specific reason, just to catch up. We met at a casual restaurant near campus, the kind of place with burgers and fries, nothing fancy. The conversation was awkward at first, with both of us making small talk about work and school and the weather. But then Dad asked about my classes and actually listened when I explained my coursework. I asked about his job, and he told me about a project he was managing without trying to make it sound more impressive than it was. We talked about Uncle Roy's family and some upcoming holidays. Somewhere during the meal, Dad mentioned a memory of Mom making terrible pancakes on Sunday mornings, how she'd burn them every time but insist they were perfect. I laughed because I remembered those pancakes, and then I shared a memory of Mom singing off-key in the car, and Dad smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. We ended up talking about her for almost an hour, sharing stories and acknowledging how much we both missed her. Dad admitted something I'd never heard him say before, that he wasted her insurance. Money because he was trying to avoid feeling the grief of losing her. He said staying busy with investments and schemes, and the boat kept him from sitting with the pain, but it also meant he dishonored her memory by squandering the gift she left us. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just told him I understood, which I did. We agreed to do dinner again in 2 weeks, making it a regular thing. Over the next few months, those dinners became easier and more comfortable. We still had moments of tension when the past came up, but mostly we talked about current things and shared memories of Mom. Dad started opening up about his therapy sessions and the work he was doing to understand his choices. I told him about my research and the ethical questions I was wrestling with regarding our partnership. Neither of us pretended the damage wasn't real, but we were both trying to move forward instead of staying stuck in anger and resentment. Adelaide Woods invited me to her house for tea on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. She lived in a small cottage filled with books and photographs, including several pictures of Mom from before I was born. Adelaide had been Mom's closest friend, and she'd stayed in touch with our family even after Mom died. We sat in her kitchen drinking chamomile tea while Adelaide told me she'd been watching Dad and me at family gatherings, noticing how we were slowly rebuilding our relationship. She said seeing us work toward reconciliation would have made Mom so happy that Mom always worried about what would happen between Dad and me after she was gone. Adelaide went to her bedroom and returned with a wooden box containing letters Mom had written during her final months. She'd already given me some of Mom's letters months earlier, but these were different. Adelaide explained that Mom had written specific letters to different people with instructions about when to share them. There was one addressed directly to me with a note saying Adelaide should give it to me when she thought I was ready to hear it. I opened the envelope with shaking hands and read Mom's handwriting telling me she knew life would be hard after she was gone. She wrote about how Dad would struggle and make mistakes because grief makes people do strange things. She said she hoped I'd remember that family is worth fighting for even when they disappoint you, that love doesn't mean accepting harm, but it does mean leaving room for people to change and grow. Mom wrote that she was giving us the insurance money as a foundation for both our futures, hoping it would bring us together rather than drive us apart. Reading those words broke something open inside me, and I cried in Adelaide's kitchen while she held my hand. Adelaide said Mom would be proud of the woman I'd become, and the choices I was making now to heal our family. Driving home with Mom's letter on the passenger seat, I felt like I'd been given permission to let go of some of the anger I'd been carrying, to honor Mom's memory by choosing reconciliation over revenge. My master's program required a capstone project for graduation, a major research paper that demonstrated mastery of the field and contributed original insights. I'd been thinking about topics for weeks, considering various aspects of business management and organizational behavior. But after reading Mom's letter and reflecting on everything that happened with Dad, I knew what I needed to write about. I chose to research family business partnerships, conflict resolution strategies, and the ethics of using legal leverage in personal relationships. The topic was personal, but I approached it academically, reviewing literature on family systems, contract law, business ethics, and conflict mediation. My advisor Lorelei approved the topic with some concern about maintaining objectivity given my personal experience. I assured her I would analyze the situation critically and include perspectives beyond my own. Writing the paper forced me to examine my choices from multiple angles, to consider not just whether I had the legal right to enforce the contract, but whether it was ethically justified to use that right as a weapon. I researched cases of family business disputes that ended in permanent estrangement, analyzing the long-term costs of winning legal battles while losing relationships. I studied mediation techniques and restorative justice approaches that prioritized healing over punishment. The research made me confront uncomfortable truths about my own behavior, how I'd let anger drive me toward cruelty even when Dad was already facing consequences. I still believed Dad needed to be held accountable for breaking his promise and wasting Mom's insurance money. That hadn't changed. But I could see now how I'd crossed lines, how I'd used my legal advantage to inflict maximum damage rather than seeking fair resolution. The paper became a way to process everything that happened while contributing something meaningful to academic understanding of family conflict. I sent Dad a draft of my capstone paper with a note saying he didn't have to read it if he didn't want to, that it analyzed our situation honestly and might be painful. He called me 2 days later saying he'd read the whole thing twice. His voice was quiet when he told me the paper was painful but fair, that seeing our situation described academically helped him understand how badly he'd failed me, and why I responded the way I did. Dad said reading my analysis of his choices, broken down into patterns of behavior and psychological motivations, made him see himself more clearly than any therapy session had. He could see his pride, his impulsiveness, his need to appear successful, all laid out as factors that led to catastrophic decisions. But he also said the paper helped him understand my perspective, how his betrayal felt like losing Mom all over again, how the contract became a way to regain control when everything felt chaotic and unfair. Then Dad surprised me by asking if he could write a response paper from his perspective, not to excuse his actions but to contribute to my research. He said having both viewpoints might make the case study more valuable, showing how the same events looked from different positions within the conflict. I was shocked he'd suggest that, but I agreed immediately. Lorelai was enthusiastic about the idea when I told her, saying dual perspective analysis would strengthen the research significantly. Dad worked on his response paper for 3 weeks, and when he sent it to me, I was impressed by his honesty and self-awareness. Dad's response paper opened with a direct acknowledgement of his failures as a father and his misuse of Mom's insurance money. He wrote about the pride that made him join Vince's investment schemes, how he wanted to be seen as successful and financially savvy rather than just a regular guy with a regular job. Dad described his thinking when he decided not to pay for my college, how he'd convinced himself that I'd be fine on my own and that the rental properties would eventually make us both wealthy. He admitted he knew at the time it was wrong, but couldn't bring himself to face that truth because it would mean admitting he'd wasted Mom's gift. The paper detailed his shock when the partnership contract trapped him, how he felt betrayed and manipulated, but also dimly aware that he'd brought it on himself by signing without reading. Dad wrote about the shame of being financially destroyed by his own daughter, how every payment felt like proof of his failures compounding. But he also described how that shame eventually cracked open his denial and forced him to get help, to start therapy and face the reality of his choices. He wrote about the wake-up call of nearly having a heart attack from stress, how lying in that hospital bed made him realize he'd rather rebuild a relationship with me than die holding on to his pride. Dad's paper included specific examples of lessons he learned through the contract enforcement, how being held accountable taught him things about responsibility and consequences that he'd avoided learning his whole adult life. My advisor Lorelai read both papers together and told me they created a powerful case study about family conflict, accountability, and the complex ethics of using legal systems to address personal betrayals. She said the dual perspective showed how both parties in a conflict can be simultaneously right and wrong, justified and cruel, victims and perpetrators. Lorelai suggested submitting the combined papers to academic journals that focused on family business dynamics and conflict resolution. The research had become something bigger than just my degree requirement. The final semester of my master's program started in January with a strange awareness that the partnership contract would end in 4 months. I'd been so focused on the immediate challenges of school and rebuilding my relationship with Dad that I hadn't fully processed what it would mean when the legal arrangement finally terminated. Dad had made every modified payment on time since we restructured the terms, never missing a deadline or asking for extensions. His bank statements showed careful budgeting and responsible financial management for the first time in years. He wasn't wealthy by any measure, still living in his modest apartment and driving his old sedan, but he was stable. He had savings for emergencies, he paid his bills without panic, and he'd stopped chasing schemes that promised easy money. Watching Dad manage his finances responsibly felt like a real victory, even though it came through painful means. During one of our regular dinners, Dad mentioned he'd been tracking his payments and realized we only had 4 months left. He looked both relieved and sad when he said it, like he was ready for the obligation to end, but also aware that our relationship had been rebuilt within the structure of that contract. I told him I'd been thinking about the same thing, wondering what our relationship would look like without the legal framework forcing us to stay connected. Dad said he hoped we'd keep having dinners and staying in touch, that he didn't want the end of the contract to mean the end of our reconciliation. I assured him I wanted the same thing, that we'd spent too much effort rebuilding to let it fall apart now. The conversation made me realize how much had changed since I first trapped him in that partnership. Back then, I wanted him to suffer and pay for what he'd done. Now I wanted him to be okay, to have a stable life, to be my father again in some form. The transformation hadn't been clean or simple, and we both carried scars from the conflict, but we'd survived it and found something worth keeping. A consulting firm called me in March, asking to schedule an interview for a position they'd seen advertised through the university's Career Center. The firm specialized in family business mediation, helping multi-generational companies navigate succession planning, sibling disputes, and conflicts between family members in business partnerships. The recruiter said they were specifically interested in my research on family business conflict and my personal experience with resolving complex family dynamics through legal and mediation frameworks. I interviewed with 3 different people over 2 weeks, and each conversation felt surreal as I talked about my situation with Dad as professional experience rather than personal trauma. The senior partner who made hiring decisions told me they rarely found candidates who understood family business conflict from both academic and lived perspectives. She said most mediators either had the theory or the experience, but rarely both, and that my combination of rigorous research and personal stakes made me uniquely qualified. They offered me the position at a salary that was significantly higher than I expected, enough that I'd be financially independent when the contract ended and could actually start rebuilding my savings. I accepted immediately and called Dad to tell him. He was genuinely excited for me, asking questions about the work and the firm and whether I'd be staying in the area. I told him the office was local and I planned to stay nearby, which seemed to relieve him. That night I thought about how strange it was that the worst conflict of my life had somehow prepared me for meaningful work, helping other families avoid destroying each other. The consulting job felt like proof that something good could come from even the most painful experiences, that the lessons learned through our partnership might help other people navigate similar situations with less damage and more grace. When the contract ended, I'd have a career built partly on what Dad and I had been through together, which felt like a strange kind of redemption. Dad called me in April sounding nervous and asking if we could meet for coffee. When we sat down, he told me he'd been saving small amounts from his paychecks over the past 6 months, setting aside whatever he could after paying bills and making contract payments. He'd managed to save almost $800 and wanted to give it to me as a graduation gift, even though he was still making his final contract payments. Dad said he knew it wasn't much, but he wanted to give me something that came from his choice rather than legal obligation, something that showed he was proud of me and wanted to celebrate my achievement. I was genuinely touched by the gesture, knowing how tight his budget was and how much discipline it took to save anything while meeting the payment schedule. But I told him to keep the money and keep saving for his own future. I explained that the best gift he could give me was building a stable life, so I didn't have to worry about him anymore, so I could know he'd be okay when the contract ended, and I started my new job. Dad looked relieved when I said that, admitting he'd been worried about what would happen after the payments stopped, whether he'd be able to maintain his stability without the structure forcing him to budget carefully. I suggested he keep saving, and maybe work with a financial advisor to plan for his future, to build on the progress he'd made rather than sliding back into old patterns. Dad agreed and thanked me for refusing the gift, saying it meant more that I cared about his long-term stability than that I accepted money from him. We talked about his plans after the contract ended, about whether he'd stay at his current job or look for something different, about his relationship with Olivia and where that might lead. For the first time in years, Dad was thinking about his future with hope, instead of desperation or shame. My graduation ceremony for the master's program was scheduled for mid-May at the university's stadium. I sent invitations to Dad, Uncle Roy, Madison, Alexander, Adelaide Woods, and Professor Parks, half expecting some of them not to come. But they all showed up, sitting together in a section reserved for families of graduates. The ceremony lasted almost 3 hours with hundreds of students receiving degrees across different programs. When they called my name, I walked across the stage to receive my diploma and heard Dad cheering louder than anyone else in the stadium. Looking out at the crowd, I saw him standing and clapping with his hands over his head, completely unselfconscious about making noise. Uncle Roy was standing too, and Madison, and all the others who'd watched our family conflict unfold and then witnessed our slow reconciliation. Walking off that stage with my diploma, I felt tears running down my face for the first time in years, but they were happy tears instead of angry or sad ones. After the ceremony, everyone gathered for photos and congratulations. Dad hugged me and told me he was genuinely proud despite everything that happened, that seeing me succeed meant more to him than I could know. Adelaide Woods said Mom would have been so proud of both of us, of me for my achievement, and of Dad for showing up and being present. Professor Parks congratulated me on the capstone paper and said the consulting firm was lucky to have me. Alexander reminded me that his dad's entrepreneurship competition had started this whole complicated journey, and look where we'd ended up, standing there surrounded by people who loved me and supported me, with Dad beside me looking proud and stable and present. I felt like we'd finally reached a place worth celebrating. The week after graduation, we had our final meeting with Tamara at the university legal office to officially close out the partnership contract. She pulled up all the documents on her computer and reviewed every payment Dad had made over the past 4 years, every expense I'd submitted, every modification we'd negotiated after his hospitalization. The tutoring business had brought in over $60,000 in revenue during that time, all of it funneling back into my educational expenses per the contract terms. Dad sat across from me looking tired but calm, wearing a decent shirt he'd probably bought at a thrift store but pressed carefully. Tamara printed out the final settlement documents showing Dad had fulfilled every single obligation under the modified agreement. She asked if we had any disputes or concerns before signing the closure paperwork. Dad shook his head and picked up the pen. I watched him sign his name on the line that released him from the partnership, officially ending the legal arrangement that had controlled both our lives since my sophomore year. Tamara witnessed our signatures and filed everything in her system. She told us the business entity would remain active for 30 days in case any final expenses came through, then it would dissolve automatically. We walked out of her office together without speaking until we reached the parking lot. Dad stopped next to his old sedan and looked at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I told him I'd be in touch soon and drove back to my apartment. 2 days later, I went to the bank and had them cut a check for $15,000 from the tutoring business account. I drove to Dad's apartment complex, a rundown place on the east side of town where the parking lot had potholes and the buildings needed paint. His unit was on the second floor at the end of a concrete walkway. I knocked and waited, hearing his footsteps inside before he opened the door looking surprised to see me. I held out the check and told him this was his share of the business profits, that Mom would have wanted her insurance money to help both of us build better futures, even though it took a complicated path to get there. Dad stared at the check like he didn't understand what he was seeing. He tried to push it back toward me, saying I'd earned that money through all the work I put into the tutoring business, that he didn't deserve anything after what he'd done. I insisted that we'd earned it together through the partnership, even if the partnership started from anger and revenge on my part. The business succeeded because he showed up to every meeting, signed every paper, fulfilled every obligation even when it nearly destroyed him financially. I told him to take the money and use it wisely this time, to prove he'd actually learned something from the past 4 years. Dad's hands shook when he finally took the check. He asked if I wanted to come inside for a few minutes. I followed him into his apartment, which was basically empty except for a cheap folding table, 2 plastic chairs, and an air mattress in the corner of the living room. The kitchen had a microwave, a coffee maker, and some dishes stacked on the counter. Dad noticed me looking around and said he'd been putting every extra dollar toward the contract payments. That furniture seemed less important than keeping his legal obligations. I felt guilty seeing how bare his life had become, even though part of me thought he deserved it for wasting Mom's money in the first place. 3 weeks later, Dad called and invited me to see his place again. When I arrived, the apartment looked completely different. He'd bought a used couch and coffee table, a real bed frame and mattress, a small dining table with actual chairs. The walls had a few framed pictures, including one of Mom from before she got sick. Dad showed me around like he was proud of creating a space that felt like a real home instead of just a place to sleep between work shifts. He explained that he'd used about half the money I gave him to furnish the apartment properly and put the other half in a savings account for emergencies. I asked if he was working with a financial advisor like we'd discussed. He pulled out a folder with budget spreadsheets and savings goals, all handwritten, in his careful printing. His therapist had recommended a financial counseling service that helped people rebuild after money problems, and he'd been meeting with them twice a month to learn actual money management instead of just chasing get-rich schemes. Dad made coffee, and we sat on his new couch talking about his plans for the future. He wanted to stay at his current job for at least 2 more years to build up his savings and emergency fund. He was thinking about taking some management courses at the community college to improve his skills and maybe qualify for a better position eventually. He talked about maybe dating again someday, but not until he felt stable and confident in himself. Listening to him plan his future with realistic goals and careful thought, I realized he'd actually changed in a fundamental way. The man sitting across from me wasn't the same person who'd bought a $50,000 boat for fake business meetings or spent Mom's insurance money on condemned houses without doing basic research. I started my new job at the family business consulting firm the first week of June. The office was downtown in a renovated building with exposed brick and big windows. My boss assigned me to shadow the senior consultants for the first month to learn their process for handling family business disputes. My first real client case came in mid-July, a father and son fighting over succession planning for their manufacturing company. The father wanted to retire but didn't trust his son to run things properly. The son felt like his father was holding him back and refusing to acknowledge his capabilities. They'd stopped speaking to each other and were communicating only through lawyers, which was costing them thousands in legal fees, while their business suffered from lack of clear leadership. I sat in the initial meeting listening to them attack each other, and it felt like watching a replay of my own family conflict. The father accused his son of being ungrateful and inexperienced. The son accused his father of being controlling and unable to let go. I recognized the same patterns of pride, fear, and broken communication that had poisoned my relationship with Dad. Over the next 6 weeks, I worked with them to create a transition plan that addressed both their concerns. The father needed to feel respected for building the business and confident that his legacy would continue. The son needed to feel trusted and given real authority to prove himself. We structured a gradual handover with clear benchmarks and regular check-ins, giving them a framework to rebuild their relationship while managing the business transition. By September, they were speaking directly again, and the son was successfully running day-to-day operations, while his father served as an advisor. Watching them shake hands at our final meeting, I felt like the painful situation with Dad had actually prepared me for meaningful work, helping other families avoid destroying each other. 6 months after graduation, I called Dad and suggested we take a trip together to visit Mom's grave. We hadn't been there together since the funeral 5 years ago. He agreed immediately, his voice getting quiet on the phone. We drove out on a Saturday morning in early December when the weather was cold but clear. The cemetery was on the west side of town, a peaceful place with old trees and well-maintained grounds. We walked together to Mom's headstone, a simple granite marker with her name and dates. Dad had brought flowers, white roses that were her favorite. I stood there looking at her name carved in stone and felt the weight of everything that had happened since she died. Dad started talking first, his voice breaking as he apologized to her for wasting the money she'd left to take care of us. He told her about the boat and the houses and all his stupid decisions, how he'd let pride and greed make him abandon his promise to pay for my education. He said he was sorry for the pain he'd caused me, and sorry for dishonoring her memory by being selfish and irresponsible. Then I apologized too, telling Mom I was sorry for using her insurance money as a weapon, for becoming cruel and vindictive even if Dad deserved consequences for his choices. I promised her we'd stay connected even when things were difficult, that we wouldn't let money or pride damage our relationship anymore. Dad reached over and took my hand, and we stood there together crying in front of Mom's grave. It felt like the closure we both needed, like we'd finally acknowledged the hurt we'd caused each other and could start moving forward as family instead of adversaries. In February, Dad called sounding nervous and asked if we could meet for dinner. We went to a casual restaurant near his apartment, and after we ordered, he told me he'd started dating someone. Her name was Olivia, and he'd met her at his therapy group. She'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years ago and understood grief in a way most people didn't. Dad had been seeing her for about 2 months but hadn't mentioned it because he wasn't sure how I'd react. He seemed genuinely worried that I might be upset or feel like he was replacing Mom. I told him I was happy for him, that Mom would want him to build a life beyond just surviving and paying off obligations. I asked about Olivia, what she was like, how they'd met. Dad relaxed and started talking about her with real warmth in his voice. She worked as a nurse at the hospital, had 2 grown kids who lived out of state, loved gardening and old movies. They'd started talking at therapy group and discovered they both struggled with moving forward after losing their spouses. Dad said Olivia made him feel like he could be honest about his failures and mistakes without being judged, that she'd been through her own difficult times and understood that people could change. Seeing Dad talk about someone with genuine affection, building a relationship based on honesty instead of trying to impress people, showed me how much we'd both healed from the anger and resentment that had defined us for so long. The consulting firm promoted me to senior associate in April after I'd successfully closed several complex family business disputes. My boss called me into her office and said my combination of legal knowledge, business skills, and personal experience with family conflict made me uniquely valuable to the firm. She'd been watching how I handled difficult clients, how I could recognize the emotional patterns underneath the business disputes, and address both the practical and personal issues that were destroying families. The promotion came with a significant raise and my own office with a window. I'd be taking on more challenging cases and mentoring junior consultants who were just starting out. Standing in my new office looking out at the city, I thought about how the painful situation with Dad had actually prepared me for this work. If he hadn't betrayed me by wasting Mom's insurance money, if I hadn't forced him into that partnership contract, if we hadn't spent 4 years fighting and eventually reconciling, I wouldn't understand family conflict the way I did now. The experience had been brutal and damaging, but it had also taught me things about accountability, consequences, forgiveness, and change that I couldn't have learned any other way. I called Dad to tell him about the promotion, and he sounded genuinely proud, saying Mom would be amazed to see what I'd built from such a terrible situation. In June, Dad called and asked if I could come over because he had something important to tell me. When I arrived at his apartment, Olivia was there too. They were sitting together on the couch holding hands, both looking nervous and excited. Dad told me they'd gotten engaged and asked if I'd help plan the wedding. I felt my eyes fill with tears, but they were happy tears this time. I hugged them both and told them I'd be honored to help. The fact that Dad was including me in his happiness instead of hiding his choices or being defensive about them felt significant. It showed how far we'd come from the years of anger and broken trust. Olivia hugged me and said she'd heard a lot about me, both the difficult parts and the healing parts, and she admired that Dad and I had done the hard work of rebuilding our relationship instead of just giving up on each other. Over the next few months, I helped them plan a small ceremony at a garden venue with close family and friends. Dad wanted Uncle Roy to stand up with him. Olivia's daughter was flying in from California to be her maid of honor. They weren't doing anything fancy or expensive, just a simple celebration of finding each other and building a new life together. Watching Dad plan his wedding with care and joy, making decisions based on what actually mattered instead of trying to impress people, I felt genuinely excited to help him celebrate this new chapter. The wedding was on a warm Saturday in September at a small garden venue outside town. The ceremony was short and sweet with about 40 people attending. Dad wore a simple gray suit and looked happier than I'd seen him in years. Olivia wore a cream-colored dress and carried roses. When it came time for toasts at the reception, I stood up with my glass and talked about second chances, accountability, and the hard work of rebuilding trust after betrayal. I acknowledged that Dad had made terrible choices that hurt me deeply, that he'd stolen my education fund and forced me to take extreme measures to hold him accountable. But I also recognized my own capacity for cruelty when I felt wronged, how I'd used the contract to punish him beyond what was fair or necessary. I thanked Dad for doing the difficult work of change instead of just resenting me for holding him accountable, for going to therapy, and learning to manage money responsibly, and becoming someone Mom would be proud of. I welcomed Olivia to our complicated family, and thanked her for loving Dad enough to support him through his continued growth. By the time I finished talking, half the room was crying, including Dad and me. Uncle Roy stood up next and added his own thoughts about watching our family nearly destroy itself over money and pride, then slowly heal through hard conversations and genuine change. Uncle Roy pulled me aside during the reception while everyone was dancing and eating cake. We stood near the edge of the garden where it was quieter, and he told me that Mom would be incredibly proud of both Dad and me for finding our way back to each other. He said watching us rebuild our relationship after everything that happened gave him hope that families could survive even devastating conflicts if both people were willing to do the hard work of forgiveness and change. Uncle Roy had seen the worst of it: the family gatherings where Dad and I wouldn't speak, the phone calls where I'd vent about Dad's latest payment delay, the hospital visit when Dad had chest pains from stress. He'd worried we'd permanently destroyed our relationship over Mom's insurance money. But here we were at Dad's wedding, celebrating together like actual family instead of legal adversaries. Roy said that kind of healing didn't happen by accident. It required both of us to choose connection over being right, to value our relationship more than our pride or anger. He hugged me and said he was proud of the person I'd become, someone who could hold people accountable, but also show mercy when they genuinely changed. A year after my graduation, I got an email from the tutoring business asking if I'd join their advisory board. The current student managers had expanded operations to 3 satellite locations and were bringing in over $100,000 annually. They wanted my input on strategic planning and community outreach. I agreed and showed up to their first board meeting in the campus office I'd rented years ago when this whole thing started. The students running it now were impressive with detailed financial reports and growth projections that made my original setup look amateur. During the meeting, when they asked about future initiatives, I suggested creating a scholarship fund in my mom's name for students whose parents couldn't or wouldn't pay for their education. The room went quiet for a moment before the student president said that was exactly the kind of program they'd been wanting to launch. We spent the next hour designing the application process and eligibility requirements. Students would need to demonstrate financial need and parental abandonment of educational support, then write an essay about their situation. The scholarship would cover tuition gaps, books, and essential supplies. Within 2 months, we'd raised $15,000 from alumni donations and business partnerships. The first recipient was a girl whose father had gambled away her college fund and refused to help with even basic expenses. Watching her accept the award with tears in her eyes reminded me why I'd fought so hard against Dad in the first place. Dad started contributing to the scholarship fund every month. The amounts were small, usually $50 or $75, but they came like clockwork on the first of each month. He never missed a payment, even when I knew money was tight because Olivia had mentioned they were saving for a down payment on a house. I asked him once why he kept giving when he didn't have to, when nobody would judge him for not contributing. He said he wanted to honor Mom by helping kids who were in the position I was in when he abandoned his promise. He said every kid who got that scholarship was a chance to make up for what he did to me, that he couldn't change the past, but he could try to prevent other kids from going through what I went through. Watching him actively try to make amends through actions rather than just words showed me he'd genuinely changed. This wasn't performance to reduce contract obligations or make himself look good at family gatherings. This was quiet, consistent effort that nobody forced him to do. Olivia told me later that Dad kept a folder with updates on every scholarship recipient, reading their thank you letters and following their academic progress. He'd become invested in their success the way he should have been invested in mine from the beginning. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it proved he'd learned something real from the consequences I'd forced him to face. Professor Parks called me in June, asking if I'd speak at the undergraduate business school about entrepreneurship and family dynamics. The university wanted to feature our partnership case study in their ethics curriculum, and they thought having me present the story directly would be more impactful than just reading about it. I agreed, but insisted on telling the whole truth, including both Dad's failures and my vindictiveness. The lecture hall was packed with over 200 students when I walked in. I started by explaining how Dad spent Mom's insurance money on failed investments and a boat instead of my education, how he laughed when I asked for help with books and meal plans. Then I described creating the partnership that legally forced him to pay for everything, how I'd used the contract to punish him beyond what was fair or necessary. I talked about watching him sell his possessions and downsize his life while I added expenses every semester. Some students nodded like I was a hero, but I stopped them and explained that legal rights don't always align with moral rightness. I told them about Dad in the hospital with chest pains from stress, about reading Mom's journal and realizing she wanted the insurance money to heal our family, not destroy it. I emphasized that sometimes winning completely means losing what matters most, that I'd been so focused on making Dad pay that I almost destroyed our relationship permanently. The room was silent when I finished. During the question period, one student asked if I regretted using the contract. I said I didn't regret holding Dad accountable, but I regretted how far I'd taken it, how I'd let anger turn me cruel. Another student asked what Dad thought about me telling this story publicly. I said he'd read my presentation notes and told me it was painful but fair, that he hoped other parents would learn from his mistakes before they hurt their own kids. 3 years after starting the master's program that reignited our conflict, Dad and I have built a relationship that's healthier than it ever was before Mom died. We talk on the phone twice a week about real things, not just surface updates about work and weather. We discuss his therapy progress and my consulting cases, Olivia's new job, and my thoughts about maybe buying a house. We have honest conversations where we can disagree without either of us shutting down or getting defensive. We've established clear boundaries about money and expectations, and we respect those boundaries instead of pushing against them. There's mutual respect now that was missing when our relationship was based on his pride and my resentment. He asks my opinion on financial decisions and actually listens to my advice. I ask him about home repair projects because he's finally learned some practical skills through YouTube and community college classes. We have genuine affection that shows up in small ways, like him texting me articles he thinks I'd find interesting, or me stopping by with coffee when I'm in his neighborhood. Last month, we visited Mom's grave together and talked about how we'd both failed to honor her memory by fighting over money instead of supporting each other. We apologized to her and to each other for letting things get so bad before we figured out how to be family again. I got my education debt-free, he learned accountability the hard way, and we both learned. That family is worth fighting for, even when the fight gets ugly and painful, and almost destroys you. That's the real lesson Mom's insurance money ended up teaching us both. That love requires more than just good intentions. It requires showing up and doing the hard work even when you'd rather walk away.